We can't just choose to learn what we want to know. We have to learn what we should know. One glaring example of a state that is actively trying to bury what we should know as a part of American history is Florida, where the State Board of Education just approved a new educational curriculum, boosted by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, who awkwardly defends his state's new guidelines while simultaneously pretending he has nothing to do with them.
I didn't do it, and I wasn't involved in it. But I think what they're doing is I think that they're probably going to show some of the folks that eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life.
The Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity has announced they're moving their 2025 annual convention out of Florida. The fraternity, established for African-American men, says Governor Ron DeSantis has, quote, harmful, racist, insensitive policies against the black community. They said they made the decision following the state's new social studies curriculum approved just last week. Here's the part that's come under fire. Middle school students will be taught about various kinds of work enslaved black people were forced to perform. Some examples listed: agriculture, carpentry, and transportation. And then it says this, quote, instruction includes how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit.
In 1807, Great Britain banned the importation of slaves into British territories.
Hello, me. Meet the real me. In my misfits way of life, a dark black past is my most valued possession. Hindsight is always 20/20, but looking back, it's still a bit fuzzy. Speak of mutually assured destruction. Nice story. Cavaliers digest. Feeling paranoid to enemy of fostering. Anxiety's attacking me. My hair is getting.
In an utter tangle of priorities, black women enslaved in America became a rare pillar, receiving free health care, if not the very first. As termed by Ned and Constance Subletted in their book The American Slave Coast, the enslaved woman's womb became capitalized. Fertility and its safeguarding became of the utmost importance to those in the slave trade. Black female slaves were expected to produce 4 to 5 children. Let there be no mistake, the high mortality rate of slaves was a cornerstone of breeding's importance.
And after all of that death and destruction, the U.S. had to figure out a way to put itself back together. It had to grapple with what it meant for the United States to be a country in which black people were not enslaved, something that the country had quite literally never encountered before. This was new territory. After generations upon generations upon generations of chattel slavery, black folks were free. But what would that freedom look like? Would they be given the tools, the skills, the education, and the resources to turn this freedom into something? Or would this freedom have an asterisk by it? You have to remember that just because the Confederates lost the war on the battlefield doesn't mean that their opinions changed about who black people were and where they belonged in the social hierarchy. W.E.B. Du Bois described this period as a moment where, quote, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. The federal government would intervene to ensure that black Americans could transition into life as citizens as safely and efficiently as possible. The thing is, emancipation fundamentally restructured Southern life for both freed people and white Southerners. The former planters and enslavers lost their source of labor and sometimes even their land. During the Civil War, Union General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea, a 285-mile trek through Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah, left a large portion of the state burned to the ground and devastated by a scorched earth, total war approach. Planters and Confederate soldiers fled during the rampage, leaving a lot of land empty and untended. Sherman intended to parcel out this land to formerly enslaved people in Sherman's Field Order No. 15. This is where the famous 40 acres and a mule idea came from, though mules weren't initially part of it. Johnson believed the opposite of what General Sherman proposed. Instead of taking land from former Confederates and giving it to the freedmen, Johnson believed in pardoning Confederates, letting them back into the Union and into government without asking them for basically anything, the equal protection of the law. Seems pretty straightforward on paper. But this amendment has not always been equally enforced, to say the least. Black people's rights were definitely abridged over time. And in many places, these rights were completely and violently subverted. Many southern states hated the idea of formerly enslaved people having these rights. The Freedmen's Bureau was tasked with helping newly freed black people make a life for themselves. The Bureau helped to reunite families who had been separated during slavery, which over the course of 250 years had split apart millions of people. The Freedmen's Savings Bank, which was ostensibly created to help the formerly enslaved after emancipation, shut down within less than a decade, and the money of tens of thousands of depositors, equaling nearly $3 million, essentially disappeared.
When was the last slave freed in America? After Reconstruction ended, though, things got pretty dark pretty fast. Within a decade, black codes had been passed in every southern state, and many of them required literacy tests and poll taxes to vote. This is the beginning of Jim Crow, an era where black people had to sit at the back of the bus and drink out of separate water fountains. They even had separate schools for white kids and black kids. That lasted until 1954, when the Supreme Court decided to desegregate public schools with the Brown v. Board of Education decision. This began the civil rights movement. I don't apologize for that, nor do you actually want an apology. That was hilarious. You're probably familiar with most of what was said in that video. You might have picked out a small inaccuracy here or there, but for the most part, that was the story you learned as a kid, and the one you likely still believe. I know that because that was the story I was taught, and the story I then taught to others almost 2 decades later. They never learned that the fundamental premise of that question, that slavery ended 150 years ago, is incorrect. I'm talking about ball and chain chattel slavery. If the standard American history myth that we all grew up hearing is wrong, when was the last slave freed in America? Throughout the 1840s and 50s, Dred Scott sued his owner for his freedom multiple times. He stated that since he had been brought to the free state of Wisconsin, he was now legally free, referencing the Somerset case. The lower courts went back and forth on the matter until it reached the Supreme Court in 1857. I want you to stop for a moment and remember back to what you were taught about this case. How is the decision framed to you? Did they decide that he was free or that he was a slave? Here's the actual opinion from Chief Justice Taney.
In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times, and the language used in the Declaration of Independence, show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. And upon a full and careful consideration of the subject, the court is of the opinion that, upon the facts stated in the plea in abatement, Dred Scott was not a citizen of Missouri within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, and not entitled, as such, to sue in its courts.
So again, was Dred Scott a free man or a slave? The answer was neither. He's not a citizen, so who cares? Black people had no rights to which the white man was bound to respect. The Declaration of Independence was not referring to them. They were not created equal. They are not, have never been, and will never be citizens of the United States. The presidential election of 1876 split the popular and electoral vote. As a result, we ended up with the Compromise of 1877. Southern Democrats, who now held a majority in Congress, would accept Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president in return for the removal of federal troops from the South. This was the definitive end of Reconstruction. Without federal troops or the Freedmen's Bureau around, white supremacist violence and intimidation was allowed to run wild. What is a black code? These were a set of laws written in a colorblind fashion, making it a crime for everyone, but in practice, they were only ever illegal for black people. The black codes were basically made-up social crimes. most of which were victimless. The most important and egregious one was vagrancy, which is the act of being unemployed, usually defined as when a laborer or servant loiters away his time. Do you see why so many of the recently freed slaves signed labor contracts with their former owners? Many states imposed fines on or made it illegal for Black people to work in any industry other than agriculture or domestic service. It was also against the law to quit your job or break a labor contract, which was prosecuted as fraud or false pretenses, as they called it in many states. As a white person, you couldn't hire a freedman without proper discharge paperwork from their previous employer. This meant that as a Black person in the South, you had to have a white person who could speak for you as your employer, or at the very least, former employer. If you didn't have that protection, you ran the risk of being arrested for vagrancy. Gambling, drinking, and even carrying a concealed weapon were crimes for Black people only. Using obscene or offensive language or talking too loudly in the presence of a white woman was illegal. Remember this?
I'm gonna tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
This has been going on for over 150 years. Many states also passed what were called pig laws, elevating what would have been a petty crime to the level of a felony. Stealing a pig worth $1 would get you 5 years in prison. The theft of an 8-cent fence post was enough to get you sentenced to hard labor. And now we're getting to the point, because as soon as these laws were in place, the South began to use the Black codes to transition away from slavery and towards convict labor. After the war, prisons were few and far between. Only the worst crimes were punished with jail time. Most of the Black codes just involved a fine or hard labor. So these laws weren't designed to put Black people behind bars. They were designed to put them to work. The first system I want to talk about is convict leasing. Back in the day, justices of the peace functioned in the same way. They were innkeepers, tailors, and even plantation owners who adjudicated crime at the county level, which was most crime at this point. It was rare for the state or federal government to get involved. County law enforcement was handled by an elected sheriff. Can you figure out what's about to happen here? A sheriff's deputy, a bounty hunter, or sometimes just a random white person would seize a Black man walking along a railroad track and take him to the nearest justice of the peace / tavern owner. The justice would invariably find them guilty of something. They would impose a fine or sentence them to hard labor, which basically allowed the government to sell the convict to the highest bidder. In 1866, both Alabama and Texas leased hundreds of their prisoners to railroad companies. Within a few years, Mississippi convicts were back working on cotton plantations, and Tennessee had sent theirs across the border into the mines of Birmingham. By the time Reconstruction ended, every southern state and county had a convict leasing program. This is a natural continuation of the industrial slavery we were talking about earlier. After the war ended, companies like Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Rail switched from leasing slaves from nearby farms to leasing convicts from the government. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottonham was arrested for riding a freight train without a ticket. When no evidence or witnesses could be produced to support that charge, the judge declared him guilty of vagrancy. He was sentenced to 3 months of hard labor, extended to 6 months and 6 days to cover the court fees. Shelby County, Alabama then leased him to the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Rail Company, which put him to work on slope number 12 of the Pratt mines near Birmingham. They paid the county $12 a month for his labor. He died of disease 5 months into his sentence. Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Rail entered into its first convict leasing contract with the state of Alabama in 1888, paying anywhere from $9 to $18 a month, depending on the prisoner. By 1900, there would be over 1,000 convicts working the mines, less than 70 of which were white. It's easy not to care about these people because they're criminals, right? If you don't want to do hard labor, maybe don't commit crimes. Alabama conducted a survey of all the convicts they sent into the Pratt mines. Among the felonies, there were 11 for false pretense, which is quitting your job or breaking a labor contract, 7 for bigamy, 6 for miscegenation, which is interracial sexual relations, 4 for homosexuality, and 2 for illegal voting. Among the misdemeanors, there were 94 for petty theft, 46 for carrying a concealed weapon, 24 for false pretense, 24 for obscene language, 19 for gambling, 13 for selling whiskey, 8 not given, 7 for vagrancy, 5 for violating a contract with a white employer, 3 for bastardry, and 2 for selling cotton after sunset. Selling cotton after sunset? I thought this was America. How could the time of day affect the legality of the free exchange of goods and services? It didn't. After sunset was code. Whenever you see that, just substitute it with the phrase, for black people. This is how sundown towns worked, because they obviously couldn't pass a law explicitly stating that black people weren't welcome. They had to make it a crime to just do something after sunset. Carrying a razor in your pocket, walking along a railroad, or quitting your job. I've literally done all of those things, and I would never expect to go to prison for them. You probably noticed while going over that list that there weren't any violent crimes. People were being sentenced to hard labor for swearing or gambling. John Clark was convicted of gaming on April 11th, 1903. The usual punishment would have been 10 days of hard labor, but because of court fees, that was extended to 114 days, and he was leased to the Kohlberg mine. He died after 34 days when he was crushed by falling rock. I don't know about you, but I don't think the punishment for rolling dice on the sidewalk should be hard manual labor until death. The Kohlberg mine alone had an annual convict death rate of 30%. Counties often rented out their prisoners to any farmer or plantation owner who could afford them, which, thanks to this new system, was basically everyone. Slaves used to cost hundreds, even thousands of dollars. They were so expensive that only the richest plantation owners could participate in the trade. But leasing a convict only costs a few bucks a month. Even poor farmers can afford that. And unlike the old days, there was no incentive to keep your black laborer at least somewhat healthy. You could literally just work them to death and then get a new one tomorrow. This isn't just my enlightened historical perspective. The Department of Justice held the same opinion over 100 years ago.
This system is more cruel and inhuman than the slavery of antebellum days. Since then, the master conserved the life and health of the slave for business reasons, just as he did that of his horse or mule. But now the master treated the slave unmercifully, and with the sole object of getting the greatest possible amount of labor out of him. Moreover, a convict costs but a few dollars, while a slave used to cost several hundred.
The war on woke is really a war against young people, an extreme attack on how they think, exist, speak, and especially how they understand the world they live in. Those attacks reached new heights this week when the Florida Department of Education released shocking new guidelines on how U.S. history, particularly around racial violence, is taught. Florida middle school students will now be taught that slavery gave black people a personal benefit because they developed beneficial job skills.
The creek is plenty deep enough to sail, even with a boat full of load. The distance from the work area to the point on the latter bayou is several miles by water, fewer than land. It occurs to me that the expense of transportation would be materially diminished.
Materially diminished?
If we use the waterway.
Are you an engineer or a nigger? Are you an engineer or a nigger?
Between the 1870s and the beginning of World War I, black pioneers settled more than 100 all-black towns in the West, each with the goal of economic independence. Among the most well-known was a black district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known by its residents as Greenwood.
One thing that would probably strike us is the absolute variety of businesses. The numbers are astonishing. 30 restaurants, 45 groceries and meat markets. There were dry goods stores, milliners, photography studio, dental offices. Greenwood is no longer called Greenwood. It's now known as Black Wall Street.
This whole idea of self-containment really existed there. The dollar would stay in that community sometimes over 3-5 years before it ever went outside of the community.
In 1919, black soldiers returned from World War I with high expectations for racial progress at home. But in one city after another, white mobs erupted in violence, targeting black veterans, citizens, and businesses. Hundreds died. On Tulsa's Black Wall Street, African Americans, including armed veterans, watched nervously and prepared for what might come.
The mob comes, we're not going to run, we've got our guns, and we're going to protect ourselves. And that was especially important and valuable and potent in Greenwood.
On May 30th, 1921, the mob came to Greenwood.
A mob gathers of whites and blacks, and blacks in Tulsa are armed. This was about blacks becoming too economically powerful and showing that wealth in a way that anyone would by creating buildings and constructing churches and having property.
And then the mass invasion and the destruction of Greenwood began.
When the smoke cleared in the early morning of June 1st, 1921, Black Wall Street lay in ruins.
This is by far the largest single incident of racial violence in all of American history.
Believing that our nation is worth the investment in fighting for the children of America, that we will provide them with the information they need to go into the world and lead. All the folks that we would go out and send our children to go and meet around the world are clear about our history. And we're going to send our own children out to not know what it is? Building in a handicap for our children that they're going to be the ones in the room who don't know their own history when the rest of the world does? When I think about what is happening then here in Florida, I am deeply concerned. Because let's be clear, I do believe this is not only about the state of Florida. There is a national agenda afoot. And what is happening here in Florida? Extremists, so-called leaders, for months have dared to ban books. Extremists here in Florida pass a law, don't say gay, trying to instill fear in our teachers that they should not live their full life and love who they love. And now, on top of all of that, they want to replace history with lies. Middle school students in Florida to be told that enslaved people benefited from slavery. High schoolers may be taught that victims of violence, of massacres, were also perpetrators. They insult us in an attempt to gaslight us, and we will not have it. Adults know what slavery really involved. It involved rape. It involved torture. It involved taking a baby from their mother. It involved some of the worst examples of depriving people of humanity in our world. It involves subjecting to people the requirement that they would think of themselves and be thought of as less than human. So in the context of that, how is it that anyone could suggest that in the midst of these atrocities, that there was any benefit to being subjected to this level of dehumanization?
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter